We're on lecture 7. We started talking about organization as a characteristic of everything human, as a capacity to improve efficiency, to multiply, to self-multiply results. Then we looked at the society as a big organization, semi-formed, evolving organization. And we looked at the company as an outgrowth of that, as a miniature organization to organizing itself to seek and take in the resources and capabilities and capacities of the society. All the 5 resources we talked about, the social needs or market, the technology, the organizational capacities, the people, and the finance. And then we went to companies and focused for the last 3 lectures on the 5 engines in how a company takes those social resources and utilizes them. And then how a company implements a process of channeling energy and directing it for growth and in higher and higher performance. And finally, last week, on values as a very powerful means for doing all of this, for tuning into the society, for tapping the potentials of these 5 engines, and for energizing the people, the market, the customers, production, organization, and every aspect of the company, physically, socially, organizationally, and psychologically. Now we're going to make a transition for the last 3 lectures. In this lecture, we're going to go to the 3rd element of this program, which are the people, the individuals. The individual is also an organization, or can be understood as an organization. I'm not saying we're machines. Remember, the organizations we're talking about are organisms. They're integrated living things. The society's an organism, the company's an organism, and we are organisms. The same principles that apply in the society and in the company also apply at the level of individuals. So we're going to look at how individuals are energized and how we can tap the greater potential of ourselves and the people we work with and the organization we work with. We're going to end on a more personal note in this one. But we're going to start by linking all that we've discussed so far together by taking the example of one company. We chose this example for obvious reasons because it's a company you all know and we don't have to give a lot of background to it. It's a company that probably we all know, share experience of better than most any other company. And it's a company that exhibits many of the principles that we've been discussing and has during its lifespan so far. I'm talking about Apple computers. I'm not talking about Apple because it's the perfect company. It's not. I'm not talking about Apple to say that it's better than any other company on the planet. That's a subjective measure. I'm talking about it because I've studied it in depth. We know it well. I know the history from before it was born. And I want to try to show you how everything we've been talking about up until now in the first 6 lectures can be illustrated concretely in this development of this company. And then in the second half of today's lecture, we're going to look at the role of one individual who you all know also, who in this case played an inordinately great role in the growth of the company, Steve Jobs, to understand the relationship between the individual and the company. And what's true of Steve Jobs is true of founders and CEOs. It's true of people at all levels of companies. Only thing is we can't see that. We don't know that story so well as we know it. In this case, it's been well documented. So let's go on. I want to start by giving you a background on Apple and how it developed so that you can see, for the purpose, my interest is not really Apple. My interest is illustrating to you all the principles that we've discussed in the first 6 lectures. So the context is, I went to the university in the 1960s in UC Berkeley in north of San Francisco, just 50 miles away from what we now call Silicon Valley, where Apple was born. And I want you to understand, because we're going to talk about not only the company, but its founder, you need to know something. Maybe you know something. This was the generation called the hippie generation. This was the first generation born after World War II. I was born in 1946, in which we grew up in peace and we grew up in unprecedented prosperity compared to our parents went through 2 world wars, the Great Depression and everything. Things had been good in the US in the 1920s, but still, there had never been a generation like ours where progress and prosperity seemed to be so great. And rather than celebrating it and just leveling off and being comfortable, the generation that came of age at this time, called the baby boomer generation, we were the post-war baby boom when the husbands came home and suddenly there was a huge number of births after the war. We started looking around at the society and being unsatisfied. Not unsatisfied with the prosperity, but unsatisfied with a lot of other things. That people weren't treated equally, that the blacks weren't treated equally, that women were discriminated against, that the Hispanic farm workers were paid too little. Even the students felt. And it started at Berkeley, where I was in September '64, when the students started to complain that we need more of a role and a right and a freedom on the management of the university itself. It's a state university, one of the top universities in the country, top public universities in the country. And the students were saying, we don't like the way the university is being managed, and we should, especially the graduate students, you should allow us to have a say in the management. And in a very liberal area, in the most liberal community in the US, the university was so shocked by this demand that they refused to talk. The students sat in and created demonstrations in the administrative building. The administration called in police and threw tear gas to dispel them. And this was the beginning of a generation of protests in the US. It was aggravated by the beginnings of the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests, but it became a protest against everything. Why is this significant? For 2 reasons. Steve Jobs was 5 years younger than me, but this was the time in which he was growing up. Non-conformity, anti-establishment, question what's being done and see if it can be done better and see if it's right and true, or it can be done better or differently than it's being done. So this was the background. And out of that came the idea that our parents were all conforming. They were all doing what was proper. We had the phrase, keep up with the Joneses. If the Joneses have something next door, your neighbors have something, you also want it. You want to be accepted. You want to be respectable. You want to be equal to everybody else. Your reference point is not what you want or think. Your reference point is what everybody else will think of it. And we reacted. We as a generation reacted against that. I want to be an individual. I want to be myself. I don't want to be what my parents want me to be, or my neighbors are, or my school tells me to be, or my church tells me to be. I want to discover myself. This was the beginning of that movement towards individuality in the States, and it was very much connected with the, so nonconformity, that was the basis of the hippie movement. We ended up being conformists in another odd way. Instead of wearing a coat and tie and getting our hair nicely trimmed. Everybody was having long hair and growing beards and wearing blue jeans. And anybody who didn't do that was frowned on because they're conformists. But the truth is the hippies were conforming also. We were just conforming in a different way. This is what Steve Jobs grew up in. He was younger, but this was the atmosphere. And he believed when he was growing up that doing what everybody's doing or being accepted by everybody is not what he wants. He wants to do something unique and he wants to do something creative. And he was an oddball. He was a real rebel. He rebelled in so many different ways. I'm not justifying it. I'm not recommending it. I'm only saying, understand his personality is helpful. So this was also the period in which the mainframe computers and then the mini computers were really beginning to grow explosively as an industry, going into corporations and schools and everything else for the first time. I'm not talking about the computers we use. I'm talking about the big ones that filled the whole room. And everything was being computerized in government, in education, in business, in research, in universities, and everything like that. And there was a fear. The only people who could understand these computers were the engineers. Nobody used computers except the engineers and a few scientists, because you had to know all the Fortran, the BASIC, all the complex programming languages. We learned a programming language in college, though I never used it for anything, because that was something you should know if you were going in any science. But right at the end of the 60s was the beginning of what became known as the microelectronic revolution. It really started the third industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was steam engine, the railways, the steam ship, and all the steam-driven equipment that drove the Industrial Revolution up until the 1880s and 1890s. From around 1890, we had the electricity revolution. Electrification began, and more we went to electric motors and electricity and lights and telephones and telegraphs and all of that stuff. And it was only at the beginning of the 70s with companies like Intel and Fairchild and others that the invention of the microprocessor made possible a whole new generation of equipment called electronic. It was no longer the tubes that we used to have in our TV sets. It was electronic microprocessors. And that began the beginning of the microelectronic revolution. Now, there's one other thing you need to know to really understand Steve Jobs. What you need to know about America is, basically, we come from a history of people who do things physically. Most of Americans, of course, I'm talking generally, not of every individual. Most Americans came over as working class people seeking refuge, freedom, and opportunity in a country where everything you had to do for yourself. So people learned carpentry, they learned how to build their own houses, they learned how to build their own machinery. It's a part of the national character. Nobody in England, they used to frown on, the higher classes used to frown on people if you do something physically. In America, you were proud of the fact that you could make things, do things yourself, and you didn't have to rely on somebody else. It was part of the culture. For our sake, it was important. It was part of the culture in which Steve Jobs grew up. In fact, he grew up in the house of a craftsman, a working class craftsman, a high quality craftsman who taught him how to do things, how to do them and make them better, and how to be proud of the way they were done. So in the early 70s, he went to college for a year and then dropped out. And he was looking for a job, and he got some jobs, and he started for them, at that time, electronics became a hobby. It was a hobby you do for fun. You try to make things and assemble them. A lot of my friends, when they were growing up, earlier generation, they used to take apart car engines and assemble them again for fun. They could repair their own cars. They could build things. That was the American way. I'm not glorifying it. I'm just explaining it. So this was when he grew up. And he and a friend, Steve Wozniak, who was really a technical genius, Jobs was not, got together, and you may know the story already. They assembled their own PC from just basic components they could buy in a hardware store or electrical supply store. And they came up with the first Apple computer. And Jobs, who was not a technical genius, but he was so persuasive as a marketing guy, he could persuade anybody of anything. He went and sold an order, I think, for 50 of these things. And they had to produce them. And they produced them in his garage. They borrowed $5,000 to start the company. And that led to, are you seeing the slides? Oh.
Yes.
Okay. The one in the bottom right, Steve Wozniak was the first one, as far as we know, who connected a keyboard, a typewriter type keyboard, to a TV screen, and through a processor made what he was typing appear on the screen. He was an innovator, a real creative innovator. And then it became a color screen much later on. So they started with the Apple I, which never sold, the Apple II. We had an Apple IIe in the early 80s. And his company started growing. And then in 1982, by that time, there were a few companies selling PCs, but IBM, which was the biggest computer company in the world at that time, selling the mainframes and the mini computers, they realized that the PC was going to revolutionize the industry, because you don't have to be a computer engineer to operate it, and you don't need a room full of computers, and it's not everybody working off a terminal connected to the mainframe. You can have the PC at home, you can decentralize them, you can have each computer operating independently of the others. It became a revolution. So IBM collaborated with a nascent company nobody had ever heard of before called Microsoft. Bill Gates supplied MS-DOS, the operating system for the computers that IBM made. And IBM took a decision that after all, the more people who have these PCs, the more people will want to connect to mainframes. And therefore, they gave away the technology. They didn't patent the technology for the IBM PC. Intel was an Intel processor. The result was that within 2 or 3 years, there were 200 companies in Silicon Valley alone that were making IBM compatible PCs. And this was the time that the PC revolution really took off. And this is the time when Silicon Valley really took off and investment started to pour into this, and so much of innovation and experimentation. And that's where our story starts. You may know the story already, but that's where it starts. But there was another factor here which I haven't covered. Being of that generation, I know the psychology of the people. I remember the articles that were written. I know how people felt. For most of us in our generation, the computer was an enemy. It was a machine. It was something that replaces people. And it did replace a lot of people. It replaced a lot of accountants because it could add faster than anybody could add, and more accurately. it replaced clerical people in so many occupations. And in order to use it, you had to learn to speak the computer language. You had to learn how to write code and give commands in code. You really felt like you had to learn to be like a machine in order to communicate with it. And there was a lot of fear and anxiety in American society at that time, as there is even today when they talk about artificial intelligence of eliminating so many jobs. There was a lot of feeling that computers are going to replace us. Any of you are familiar with George Orwell's novel?
1984.
Yes.
Any of you?
We read it.
Huh? You read it? Huh?
Yes.
So we grew up with that as a reading assignment when we were in high school, because this had nothing to do with computers at that time, because it was he wrote it, I think, in the 40s or even the 30s. He wrote about a society where the authority at the top takes over and freedom and individuality is lost. And the head of the community, the whole world was divided into, he wrote that before the end of the World War II and before the Cold War, when we really got a kind of Orwellian society where the whole world was in two blocks. And one of them was very authoritarian, at least one of them was. And the head of this super community, this empire, was called Big Brother. Big Brother was there watching you all the time. He could see you wherever you were. He could trace whatever you're doing, and he could arrest you if you had a thought that wasn't acceptable. This was a Western way of trying to, a projection on what it was like to live behind the Iron Curtain, which we didn't know. But Orwell was warning us against the collective life that takes away individuality. So we didn't have that. We didn't grow up with it, but it was in our mythology that that's the thing you have to be afraid of. So then we come to February 1984. Bonnie, can you help us out here? And this young lady, any of you recognize her? She's very famous, but I don't know her name.
This is Victoria.
There's no sound here, I think. It's only 3. It's jerking. It's not playing smoothly.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people. One will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
This was the ad that Apple showed at the 1984 Super Bowl. It cost them about $1.5 million. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak designed the ad themselves against the opinion and the support of the board of directors of Apple, and paid for it personally to be shown. The board of trustees, the board of directors was horrified at this ad and thought it would be a disaster. And it was rated the most successful television ad of all time up until then. And what you saw, you can watch it on YouTube anytime. Just go the 1984 Super Bowl ad or the Macintosh Super Bowl ad. It's very, very famous. what you saw was that no mention of George Orwell, no mention of Big Father, but the figure on the screen was the Big Father, and the police behind, and these people sitting there were the thoughtless people who just are following, mesmerized, following instructions. And in runs this athlete, who's the individual, and with one blow, she destroys the hypnotism of authoritarianism and liberates humanity. Well, Steve Jobs wasn't talking about George Orwell's novel at all, but of course the reference was directly to why 1984 won't be 1984. It was talking about IBM. It was talking about the IBM mainframe, or any mainframe, it's a symbol only, of course, saying that we have come to liberate humanity from submission and domination by the machine. We are going to introduce a machine that liberates human beings and empowers them, rather than dominates and suppresses them. And I told you this whole long story up until now to illustrate, to make it clear, Steve Jobs understood the American people. He understood our generation. He understood that the computer meets physical needs, efficiency needs, organizational needs, but there's also a human psychological component which is really powerful. And people are afraid. They're afraid of a machine that tells us how to behave. And so he introduced a machine that behaves the way we behave, that speaks English, that does things the way we do it, rather than making us do what he did. And that was the launch of the first graphic user interface, first the Lisa computer, which was named after his daughter, and then which didn't succeed, and then the Macintosh, which started in 1984. That happened to be just the time when we went into Apple to study it, and I remember the first Mac I saw was like the one in the picture here. Oh, it's not, you're not seeing it maybe now.
The PowerPoint you have to show some.
I have to share it again. 1 second. Now you can see it?
Yes.
Let me come back. Okay. This was what I saw, a little computer in the lobby of the Apple headquarters with the hotel, with hello on it, and another one with a smiling face on it. Hello, notice, was not written in typing, it was written in a script, because this was the first computer that could show script, was the first computer that could show graphics too. It had the desktop, it works like we do. We've got a desktop, we've got a trash can, we've got file folders. It went over backwards to convert the technology to work the way we work. He was not selling a machine, he was selling a religion. He said the religion of Apple is, it wants to empower people. Technology that will empower individuals and liberate us from the drudgery of work or the uniformity of doing what everybody else is doing. He understood the psychological appeal. And Apple at that time was the largest, for a time, it was the largest computer company before the Mac. And pretty soon it was overtaken by the IBM PCs. When we went in there, it had about 15% of the US market share. But Mac had become a symbol of personal empowerment, individuality, and the human conquest over technology. That's the story. Remember, I said that market is created out of social needs and social aspirations. It's the society. He understood not the demand for physical machines, he understood the needs of the society, and he designed a new product, not so much tailored for technology. It was a technological product and an advanced, very advanced product, but he was targeting means. It didn't do things physically much better than others, but it did them in a way that made you feel a lot different.
I think the principle now of Apple mobile phones is the same, even now.
In fact, you're absolutely right, Anna, absolutely right. But the point is, the principle of all computers became that. What he did became not immediately, it took a long time, and that's the story I want to tell. It took Microsoft 10 years to create an operating system that could duplicate the graphic user interface, the ease of use that the Mac had in 1986, 88, 87. But the reason why Mac didn't become a glorious success at that time, we had one of the early Macs, was that the technology wasn't ready. The idea was ready, the software was ready, but it cost too much. You needed a lot of RAM. You needed a lot of storage space. The processors were too slow to handle it. So it wasn't really a commercial success. And when Steve Jobs demanded that Apple continue with this, he finally fought so much with the board of directors, he was the largest shareholder, that they not only fired him and threw him off the board. They threw him out of the company he'd founded. He said later it was the most humiliating and painful experience of his life. But he also said later, it was the most valuable lesson he ever learned. There's I haven't seen it. There's a graduation ceremony at Stanford University. It's on YouTube. I think it's 2002. A very famous speech.
We know it. It's a very famous speech, yeah,
Famous.
by Steve Jobs, yeah.
Yeah, he refers back to what he learned from this experience. So you know something of the personality of this guy. Then what happened? He went out and started Next Computer, invested $7 million. Oh, don't feel too sorry for him when he got kicked out. When he left Apple, he was worth about 200 million just by selling his shares. He took 7 million, invested in a company called Next, because he wanted to prove he was right and all of them were wrong about the future of the graphic user interface. And he created a far superior computer to the Macintosh and started selling it. His goal was to sell about 20,000 a month, but he could only sell 400 a month. The problem was that the technology was so sophisticated that his PC cost $10,000 when you could buy an IBM compatible PC for about 2,000. And there simply was no market for it. This operating system he developed at this time, 10 years later, he sold it. 10 years he was ahead of time. 10 years later, he sold this operating system back to Apple, the company that threw him out, for $400 million, because it was so superior to anything else that existed. And by that time, the technology, the processor speed, the cost of RAM, the cost of the storage space and everything had come down so much that his computer could be very cost effective and operational. And that's jumping ahead of the story. One more step in between is that in 1986, he bought a company called Pixar, and I'm forgetting the name, George Lucas. Pixar was a company started by George Lucas, who's the one who did the Star Wars movies and Indiana Jones movies. He was one of the most, like Spielberg, he was one of the most famous Hollywood producers at that time. He had created this Pixar because he believed that the computer animation could radically transform the motion picture industry. So he built computers and software for computer animation. The problem was there were very few companies that knew anything about animation or believed in it or were willing to invest $30,000, $35,000 in a computer that would do this. His biggest main customer was Disney. And the problem was the company was bleeding money. Lucas finally sold the company to Apple because he was losing so much money. And Steve ran it until it was going out of business. And just at the point it was going out of business, they had a small animation division that was making pilot movies, animated films, just to show what their software could do and their hardware could do. And one of the head of that division came to Jobs and said, I need $200,000 to make a 3-minute animated movie to show what we can do. For the company that was already going out of business, it seemed like a waste of money. But Jobs was really intrigued, and he put up the 200 or 300, I forget exactly the number, that was necessary. And they came up with a 3-minute animated video about toys, a story about humans and toys. And it was shown at the Academy Awards, and it won the award as the best animated film, won an Oscar. He was approached by Disney, and they asked him, can you make a movie out of this? And they made the first movie called Toy Story out of this. Toy Story had revenues of $362 million. There had never been an animated movie that came anything like it. And then they asked him to make Toy Story 2, and there was Toy Story 3, and the whole history of everything after that. And he finally sold Pixar to Disney for $7.5 billion, a company he had invested $10 million in. So what he showed here was his investment of that $200,000 in an apparently lost cause to see the future, to believe that the future might be very different from the past. And now, of course, all movies are animated, and it's very difficult to tell what's real, what's human, and what's animated in them. It transformed the whole industry. But his heart was still in Apple. And now I get to the end of the story that I want to tell, and then I'm going to give it. But this was the important point. 1997, he was approached by Apple, and they said, we want to buy your operating system for Next, which was already 10 years old. Windows had Microsoft had come out with Windows 95, which was supposed to be the equivalent of the operating system the Macintosh had 10 years earlier, or 7 years earlier, but really wasn't as good. And now Apple bought Next operating system, which was light years ahead of where Windows 95 was. And that's how he came back. Now, the most interesting part of the story for me is what happened after that. After it was announced that Steve Jobs is coming back to Apple, the press, the business press, interviewed Michael Dell. Michael Dell was the head of the, I think you know the name, he was the founder. He founded the company as a college employee, a college student at the age of 19 or something, built his company up to the largest PC company in the world at the time of this, we are now, 97. It was #1 in the world. And he had done it in a very clever way. Because if you sell computers in the US, you sell them through retail stores, about 40% of the margin of the price of the computer goes to the retailer, who buys the computer, showcases them, and sells them to the customer. And Dell said, I want to have the lowest cost, best quality computer available. I'm not selling through stores. And even, I'm talking before the internet now, not now. I'm selling by telephone. And he took, his wholesale business was done by telephone, and he had produced a high quality item at a very very high quality item, could offer it at a low price because he wasn't paying the retailers. And he did another thing also. He produced computers only after they were ordered and paid for. He never had dead stock. He never had something he couldn't sell. He only sold it first and then it got paid for. Now, 1994, the internet came. And by 1995, it was becoming pretty obvious that the internet was better than a telephone if you wanted to sell something. And so Dell changed his whole business model, his own marketing strategy, from selling on the telephone or selling through newspaper ads to selling over the internet, where people could go and customize their own computer. It's no big deal to us. We've all bought things on the internet and you know how it works. But this was the beginning. So this was the context when the business press asked Michael Dell, what's your advice to Steve Jobs? Michael Dell said, look, it's common sense. The computer, the personal computer is a commodity. Anybody can buy the parts. Anybody can buy the displays, the chips, the processor, the disks, and put it together. It doesn't take a genius, but you've got to sell it. We are selling the best quality PC at the lowest price through the best delivery system. Apple doesn't have a prayer in the world. There's no way by the way, by the time Jobs came back to Apple, their market share had gone from 15% to 4% in the United States. They don't have a prayer in the world. He said, my advice to Steve Jobs is sell all the assets of the company and return whatever's left to the shareholders because Apple cannot survive. Now, we all know there's a story after that. And Michael Dell was wrong. And my point in elaborating on the story was, how could he have been wrong? I want you to think about it. How could the man who had done so successfully, much more successfully than Jobs in the computer industry, who knew the whole industry backwards and forwards, who had analyzed everything, how could he be so wrong to say that there isn't a prayer in the world for the future of this company? Michael Dell is not an idiot. He's not boastful. He didn't have ill will. He simply saw things differently than Jobs did. And that's the key to this story. What did Jobs see that Dell didn't? What did Jobs do that Dell didn't do, Microsoft didn't do, or anybody else do, that changed the story so much that within less than 2 decades, this was the most valuable company in the history of the world? In the history of the world up until that time. That has to tell you something. I hope it tells you something that's been the theme of this course from the very beginning. The potential is not defined by what's in the financial statements. The potential is not defined by market share. The potential is defined by how well we understand the society we live in and the power of organization for the growth and evolution of the society. And there are many examples, and we've been trying to give you examples of how a Sears from a railway station master became the biggest retailer in the world, or Bata turned around a small shoemaking company to become the largest in the world, and Fred Smith invented a whole new industry for overnight delivery because they looked and saw things differently. Not because they're geniuses. Genius doesn't really help us. They may have been geniuses in certain ways. They were extraordinary in certain ways. They think differently. We've done a study of genius. Thinking differently doesn't require a brain twice the size. It requires a mind that's not conditioned to think like everybody else and see like everybody else. And we're going to come back to that in the next lecture. Again, I'm just picking up a theme. So this is where we were. How are we doing on time, Janani?
10 minutes behind time, I would say.
Huh?
10 minutes behind time.
So Srijit, let's go ahead and complete the story, and then we can, in this session, and please take it from here.
Can we go to the next slide, sir? Yeah, Steve Jobs was thinking something different, actually, you know. He was not having the same opinion as that of Dell's person, actually. iMac as a personal computer product was an excellent combination of the excitement of the internet with the simplicity of Macintosh in those days of 1998. As a computer company, it was so different from all the consumer products in general and computer products in particular. Apple wanted to bring out the concept of computers from its image of an industrial commodity to a very personal computing product where even students can correlate to, or educational institutions or researchers can relate themselves to, or artists, designers, or common men around the world. They were able to bring out the personal affinity towards a technological product. iMac was a huge step in personal computers. The product was one of the best with its elegance, speed, a wider 15-inch display with a G3 processor, and with 4 GB storage space. iMac truly was 10 years ahead of competitors. Those days, I'm telling about the days of 1998. It was also able to create a brand image of a futures product. Apple as a company was able to understand the needs, feelings, and dreams of people. I would like to say Apple was selling the feelings of human minds for technological products and hence very well merged with the societal aspirations. People started waiting for Apple products. iMac sold 800 pieces in just 5 months for $1 billion. Can you go to the next slide, sir? Next product was iPod, actually. It was a revolutionary product. iMac cannot be considered as a financial success, but iPod was. We all know about iPod. We can clearly see that Apple started identifying itself as a company which meets the needs of the society than just being a PC manufacturer. It revolutionized the music industry. Many business people compared it as the electronic jewelry of 20th century. iPod was launched at the time when Walkman with CDs and cassettes were ruling the minds of music lovers all around the world. Apple wanted to put more than 1,000 songs to our pockets. That was the basic idea. It was most compatible, top of the line technology with iconic design. We know that it was the most innovative portable digital music product, identifying itself with the aspirations of millions of youngsters. Apple did something which no music companies can do. No wonder that in 4 years from its launch in 2001, iPod contributed 45% of Apple's total revenue. And in 2012, iTunes sold its 25 millionth song. It even helped the Apple computers from collapsing. Even 5 years back, iPod has over 70% of the MP3 player market share. Let us see about Apple stores also. Over to you, Vani.
Srijit, before Vani goes on, I just wanted to mention, there's a whole other story about iPod, which we don't have time to elaborate, and I'm glad you didn't try, but I want to point it out. Bill Gates commented afterwards that what Steve Jobs did was absolutely incredible. And he never would have believed it was possible. And when he said that, he wasn't talking about the technology of the iPod. He was talking about what Jobs really did was an act of organizational genius. He reorganized the music industry in the world. the device was only a small part. His genius was to say, I don't need to get all of the music on a small, tiny device that you can use when you're jogging. I've got a computer, I've got the internet, we've got the music industry of the world. And if I put them all together, and he signed up the music publishers, and Bill Gates said he never would have believed it was possible to convince the publishers to give away their distribution system and allow Apple to sell the songs. And he convinced them to sell songs individually for $1 each instead of an album which had one bestseller on it and 15, 20 other songs. He persuaded them to reorganize the whole industry. And of course, that's the industry we know for the last 20 years, so you don't remember what it was like when you had to go into a store and buy a cassette or a disc, and everything went through the big publishers. His real genius was not just the electronics of the thing. He saw the whole system, how to meet the social need. That's what Srijit said. His business was not to produce electronic gadgets. His business was to meet social needs, human needs better than other people. So he said, I want something light that's got 1,000 songs on it, but I want all the choice of those songs, so I'll put the songs on my computer and I'll buy them through iTunes, and I'll tie up with the publishers so anybody can buy any song they want and load it on iTunes instantly and effortlessly. It's really a story. This is a course about organization. It's really a story about organization, social organization. He changed the organization of a whole industry. And at least Gates was generous enough to concede that. And by the way, after he did it, both Microsoft and Sony decided that now that he's done it and they know how to do it, they're going to jump in and take over, because Sony owned some of the biggest music labels already. And both of them tried and failed. Neither of them could to stay in the business. Okay, Bonnie, to the Apple Store.
So after iPod and iMac were a success, Steve Jobs was worried that the customers won't be able to appreciate the unique Apple products if they had to go through the retail stores where the stores were filled with cheap products. The salesperson won't be able to tell the important features or justify the price of Apple products. So he thought the solution was to create a Apple store, a retail store to sell only Apple products, where the salespersons will be technical experts, and he would also be able to give the customer the feel or the richness of purchasing his products. But this idea was opposed by the board directors because a retail store has always been a failure at that time. So they thought it was not a good idea to jump into retail industry. Jobs persisted on it, and then he got their approval to just run a trial run for 2 stores, and he made a prototype of it. This store, it's actually called a monument now. It became unique for its architecture genius and for its aesthetics. Jobs personally designed many of it, and of the even by choosing the paint color or the glass windows and the glass staircase that got patented. So it was pleasing, and it was also very much successful because it had Apple employees who were able to guide the customers to buy Apple products. This became very successful, wherein he revolutionized not only retail sales, but also he built on more of the brand value for Apple. You would see all the figures of the success of the store and its achievement. This was in 2001. By this time, iPod had been a huge success, and they didn't stop with that. He went on fine-tuning the features of iPod, like iPod Shuffle or iPod Mini was also released. And immediately after the release of iPod, Jobs started working on iPhone. So he thought it was only a matter of years wherein people put together a machine, a handheld device, which would not only be a music player, but would also have a camera and a phone. There were also other companies. Samsung was one on the lead. Android was working on the operating system, but iPhone was the standard. It was not only a market leader, it set in the standard. And let us look at some three main decisions that Jobs took in while designing our iPhone. First one was there were two teams wherein one team worked on a track wheel, a hardware wheel on iPod. They tried to put in the features of a phone into an iPod. And they had another team under Jobs who worked on removing all the hardware and working only on the software that we have now, a multi-touch screen, easy to use smartphone without any much of hardware on it. So at one point, Jobs said that if we are to go to the next level, we should let go of the track wheel, and he decided to go only with the multi-touch screen sensor. And while designing for that touch screen, only plastic case was used for iPod. Steve Jobs wanted to have a high quality glass that would be scratch resistant. So when he looked for a superior quality glass, Corning company was the one that used to make glasses for military purposes, and they were of superior quality that they couldn't find any use to it, so they stopped making that kind of glass. When Steve Jobs met Corning, he explained all the physical aspects of it, and he also said that he won't be able to produce the quantity that Jobs is expecting in 6 months. At that time, Steve Jobs simply said, don't be afraid if you think you will be able to achieve. This is one type of a thinking capacity that Steve Jobs always uses to bend around physical reality and make what he wants to happen when he puts his mind into it. And another, when iPhone was launched, it was hailed as a small computer that is handheld. It had a lot of features. The design was very pleasing, and it was also successful. But after 6 months of its release, Steve Jobs introduced apps distribution model that could be incorporated into iPhone. That truly marked the success of iPhone. Like now, we have an app for everything. Maybe Uber or for games or for everything. There is an app in a phone. But that model was introduced only with iPhone, and Steve Jobs introduced an open distribution model wherein a software expert can create anything that is that can be put into the phone, and all the users can be downloading it seamlessly. So integration is one value that Steve Jobs used it effectively. Like that we saw an iPod, he integrated internet, computer, and the small iPod device, and also he had the software, iTunes, and a store, iTunes store, wherein you can go and buy the music. So everything was interlocked seamlessly. The same way, iPhone was a superior device which put together so many things perfectly. So that was a major success of Steve Jobs.
I just want to highlight, this is such an important point. The success of iPhone was not just the technology of the phone, just like the iPod. The success was organizational innovation. Instead of all the software is to be developed by Apple, which was their policy, he created what you said. I just want to highlight it. An open platform where anyone in the world, he gave the code, anybody in the world could create a software for this product. And they created millions of apps that made his iPhone so successful. None of the other phones at that time could admit of other applications. It was simply a phone, a calculator, and a camera, or maybe a music player. It's an organizational innovation. It wasn't a technology innovation. That's what really made the iPhone so successful, or at least one of the things that made it so successful. Okay. Then,
The
Janani.
iPad, yes. In 2010, Jobs launched the tablet iPad. While announcing it, he said, "We have two categories of devices, laptops and smartphones," but he said he was creating a third category, which combined the best of the two, the best of laptops and smartphones. Many experts said there was no room for a third category. Who needs it? But as usual, Jobs had gauged the market right. There already did exist tablets, right, from the 1980s, but they were expensive, heavy, difficult to use. They had been used only for military and factory purposes. As with all the other Apple devices, this was easy to use. It had the touch screen that people were used to in the iPhone and the iPod. And so Jobs, as usual, he had gauged the market right. And 300,000 iPads were sold on the first day that it was made available in the US. And within a month, Apple had sold 1 million iPads, which was half the time that it took to sell 1 million iPhones. Now this device, it had something for all. It could be used for work, for study, for play, for entertainment. And I would just like to bring your attention to the last point here. People had said there is no market for the iPad, but the first year, 19 million pieces were shipped worldwide. And this figure grew to 134 million in 2019. And in the next slide, please. When Jobs, he first launched the iPad, he created one more new industry. This graph here, it shows the units sold in millions of each of the Apple products over time. So what Apple started off as, that is a PC manufacturer, it still is. That little dark orange portion right at the bottom, it shows that that market has grown over 20 years. But what is remarkable here is the number and the variety of new products that Apple has created, has developed, and the new markets it has created. The iPod that is depicted in the yellow, it was a success, but the decrease in the numbers starting from 2010, it shows that what the iPod did, the iPhone, the iPad started doing. And their rapid and enormous growth is shown here in the blue and the light purple. So basically, Apple has transformed itself from a computer manufacturer to a technology and service company by constantly reinventing itself. It has continued to grow enormously. And yes.
Thank you. Srijit. Now this is what happened. You all knew the story even before, but we wanted to put some details out there so we can work with them during the rest of the day. But we talked about growth. We talked about what they did. But how does this fit in with the theory that we've been talking about, the growth of an organization? First, the 5 engines. Srijit? You're muted, Srijit.
Okay, if we look back, our basic hypothesis was if a company attunes with the 5 elements of the society, it grows rapidly and attains sustained corporate success. And it is completely true in case of Apple. Let's take the first component, the markets. Market is in the society itself. We had seen that Apple got established in an era when US society was changing rapidly from electricity to electronics. In the days of emergence of Silicon Valley in California, and when young aspirations for becoming technological was at the peak. Apple had grown along with the societal aspirations. Its products were able to connect well with the society, whether it is iMac, iPod, iPhone or iPad, for that matter, they created a brand loyalty and prestige. Apple's designs were very elegant and iconic. We all know that, which touches the hearts of technology lovers. It also utilized the excitement of internet within the society and connected well with a technically advanced product. They are still at least 10 years ahead of competition. They also recruited the best people from the job market, from top-notch technical universities, trained them well, gave freedom for innovation and creativity. Engineers and managers competed each other to get into Apple, and a job in Apple worldwide still is a prestige among youngsters. They are all highly paid and motivated, and everyone associated with Apple, whether it is retail people or sales staffs or even suppliers for that matter, all were able to give their best in full with the organization. They also adopted state-of-art strategies and systems, starting from sourcing, manufacturing, and management. Apple believed in premium pricing. They always believed in a concept to deliver the best, touching the heart of the people with an advanced product and asked for a premium price. They never followed the low commodity approach or low price commodity approach. Never ever. Through this pricing approach, they had become the most valuable and most profitable company in the world. And Apple was able to progressively develop and balance these 5 engines. We can see in the next slide. Sir, you have got some comments here, sir?
No, I think this is, we're just trying to connect back what we've just said to what we talked about in the earlier lectures. We're just highlighting a few of the portions. What you said here is Apple didn't do one thing well. It's not just that they developed the market and he was a genius in understanding human needs. They were pioneers in the technology. They set a whole new standard for high energy people. They gave their people more freedom. They pioneered the come to work in your blue jeans if you want to. No fixed parking lots, no fixed working hours. They pioneered the idea that if you give people freedom and encourage them and give them responsibility and opportunity to be creative, they'll produce 5 times more. He set a whole new standard for Silicon Valley, started with Apple. He also learned, and this is one of the things he learned from his catastrophe at Apple the first time, he realized he needs to understand organization. He learned a lot from Michael Dell, by the way. When he came back to Apple, he studied all of Dell's management systems, just-in-time inventory systems, and everything else, so that he could be a low-cost manufacturer and not squander anything. He put in place all the latest marketing systems, and you talked about finance. So the strength of Apple is not because it was a market-driven company or a technology-driven company alone. The real strength of Apple was he developed all the resources, all the engines that the society had to offer. And that's how he became the most valuable in the world. That's the story we want to show. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you click onto the slides?
I've done it. Don't you see it?
No, there are certain points down.
Energy conversion, you want the points.
Oh, okay. So it's we had stated it in the last discussion as well. This company drew on the rising aspirations and energy of the society in which it was born actually. From 1976 onwards, if we are seeing, we can see that particular thing. They grow along with the societal aspirations. It was also driven by high goal, a revolutionary zeal to change the world. It was the most powerful product of our century, actually. They developed the state-of-art organization for technical innovation. Also, the same thing with the product development, marketing and organization of industries. or integration of their products with the consumer lifestyles and the social aspirations. They attracted and developed people with the highest level of skills and attitudes. I was mentioning before, they were recruiting people from all top-notch universities all around the world. This is one of their cause for better accomplishments, actually. They converted energy into high profitability, continuous growth and expansion, constant innovation, and the social leadership.
So this is the energy conversion process we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Releasing high energy, directing it very clearly through high goals and values, channeling it through a state-of-the-art organization, developing people with the right skills and attitudes, and releasing that to produce all, not just money, not just growth, creativity, innovation, dynamism, enthusiasm in everything they did, whether it was the advertisements or the packaging or the product design or anything else. It is the energy conversion process, and they epitomize, they really represented what can be done when it's taken to its peak. And finally, what we discussed last week, is they didn't miss on the values. I could have asked you what were the values. We've listed a few of them. We could have listed 30 values that Apple excelled in, but these are the ones for which it's really very well known, most known to the world outside. Simplicity, ease of use, integrating the product with the way we want to use it, with our lives, with our needs. Great design, perfect, simple operation, the creativity and innovation behind it. And these things don't come just because you talk about them. These only come when that process of value implementation is done as seriously as we do it in quality management systems. So I'm only trying, I think you get the idea. I'm only trying to highlight what we're talking about is not textbook theory. We're talking about the processes that are already practiced in companies. They may not describe it the way we do. They may not even know it the way we know it. But what we're talking about is real. Doesn't matter how we describe it. It matters what actually happens in the company. And that's why we've taken these three processes, because none of them by itself seems to be fully adequate to explain what's going on. So the sum of it, you already know enough of the story. They're now at about $260 billion. This is when?
Current.
Huh?
99.
Now.
Now actually, yeah.
They were the first, they became the most valuable company in the world. They're not, I don't think they are today. I think Amazon may be, but they're switching back and forth. But last year they were $1.4 trillion in value. And what are they? Their computers are only 7%. No wonder Michael Dell was wrong. He thought it was a computer company. Jobs never thought of it as a computer company. He thought of it as a company to meet human needs, and he adapted it in that way to do it. Okay, enough. We're only 5 minutes behind time. We're going to take a break now, 10 minutes. And when we come back, I said we're going to talk about the individual. And I hope you understand my purpose here was not to take Apple and hold them up as a perfect company or to idealize them or to idealize an American company, nothing like that. I just think it's a good example to illustrate when you put it all together, when you look at it all together, the companies that are really at the top, however they explain it to themselves or other people, they do all of these things and they do them well. And I would hope, I'm maybe dreaming now, but I would hope that some of you at least realize that wherever you are in the companies you're working with, if you take these principles in the work you're doing, you won't be in the same position in 12 months from now. And the company won't be where it is 12 months from now. I hope you understand this is not just for a Steve Jobs or for the CEO. The same principles can be done in any department, in any branch, in any division of any company, and to raise it up to the point where the whole company takes note. I intend that you have something that's a practical value to you in your own work, even if you're working alone, even if you're the only one in the department. If you do it, you'll see the responses. I challenge you. I hope that somebody comes and reports to me they've seen the results. Okay, let's take 10 minutes. What time is it there, Sophie?
Gary, can we have 15 minutes break? Because usually we are having 2 15-minute breaks on our lectures, and this is really hard sitting for 3 hours. 15 minutes maybe?
15 minutes. So what time is it now?
It's Tbilisi time, 2:38.
Okay, so we'll meet back at 2:55. How's that?
Yeah, yeah.
7.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
you.
Okay.
So this was meant also to be a summary of everything, of everything we've discussed up until now, taken as a case study. But we've left out an important piece, and that is the role of the individual himself. And I tried to give a context for it. You know the individual, we all know him. So I want you to now reflect on, what do you think, I'm talking from his point of view as a person now. We have an individual who, more than most, in most companies, an individual played the key role through every stage of Apple's growth. That's not the typical story of the successful entrepreneur. It's in the case of Richard Sears was out of the picture after 10 years. It was Julius Rosenwald, it was Otto Deering, and then it was Robert Wood. Each decade it was a new leader with a new vision and new skills. This is a very unusual story, but it doesn't matter whether it's one person or a group. What I'm trying to say is, what is the role of the individual in developing creating, developing, driving, energizing, transforming an organization? Because in this case, Jobs played all those roles. To understand the relationship between the individual and the organization, just as we're understanding the relationship between the organization and the society. So what can you tell me from what you know about Jobs? What were the characteristics or attributes that he had that were connected with? I don't mean that they're the only responsible reasons or that he's the only one who contributed, not at all. But what can we learn about the role of an individual in the development and success of an organization?
He was innovator, a persuasive person who was always fighting what he believed and what he thought was right and what he thought had potential in the future.
Also, he was a good leader with good leadership skills, and he was the democratic leader basically, and people was following to him. Yeah.
Anna, either of you? Any comment?
He was charismatic leader who could make others believe in his goals, that his goals was achievable, and efforting hard could make result for them.
Zizi, what was Steve Jobs? What was it about Steve Jobs that enabled him to do what? he did?
I think he had a clear vision where he was heading to, and he had that ability and gift to make the others, to enable others also see the same.
Anything else strike you?
He believed in success. He believed that his computers were the best, and he was not considering them just as a computers, but in the beginning of his career, he already saw the perspectives, what would be the other products that they would produce. So he had a clear vision where he was going to.
And also, Gary, I think that he was the guy who was born to make the change, and he knew it. He knew about it, and he made the change, this big change.
He had the determination, he had the aspiration.
Yeah, actually, these such kind of individuals are the people who come with their mission, you know, to this world. Yeah, and he had that mission, and he knew about it.
Think about the company and think about the individual. What do they have in common?
As individual, I think that Steve Jobs was also a risk-taker person, because innovations he produced he was not expected to how to say correct. He produced innovations that maybe customers will not use. And this was the risk-taking personality of Steve Jobs.
He never put profit before accomplishment. He earned more money. The company earned more money than anybody had earned, but he never made profit the chief motive. He wanted to do something new. He wanted to do something better. He wanted to make the best possible product, not just itself, but in terms of what it could do for people. And he risked, you said it already, he risked every time, even with the $200,000 for Pixar Toy Story animation, with the Apple Store, with the ad, the Macintosh ad, Super Bowl ad. He constantly took risks because profit wasn't his chief motive. It's not that he didn't like money. It's not that he didn't do it. He earned a phenomenal amount, but he took a lot of decisions that no other businessman would take. Take a look at this list. They look familiar to you? He thought independently. That's why I stressed the fact of the generation of which he came. He was not to conform and do what everybody else did. He wanted to do something different. He wanted to make a mark. We've been talking about energy, and we said Apple's a high energy company. I think anybody would agree there are very few people who had higher energy and drive for accomplishment than he did. And he was never satisfied with what he did. The energy of the company started with him. It didn't end with him. He had high energy people, he had a high energy environment, and all, but he emanated, he was an example of the high energy. He didn't just have a profit motive. He liked money. He wasn't very generous with what he had, but he really wanted to change the world. And he did, not once, but many times over. He had the courage you mentioned. He was in tune with the society in which he lived, and he understood people. He understood what they wanted. He wanted it. He gave attention to the smallest detail. Nothing was too small for him to try to make it perfect, including the design of the calculator that came free with the first Macintosh computer. He spent hours and hours trying to make the design look nicer. All the values the company had, the simplicity, the ease of use. He studied, by the way, if you don't know, he studied Zen Buddhism and loved the beauty and simplicity of the Japanese garden. He went to India for 6 months, wandering around in his youth before he started the company. He said he learned to be intuitive in India. He learned that rationality is not the highest faculty, and he learned to trust his intuition and follow it. He learned the power of organization from his failures, and I mentioned that he learned to study what Michael Dell did and others did. And the important, because he had completely ignored it during his first stint at Apple. And he could be, I think, George, you mentioned he could be really a good people person and motivate them. He could also be a terrible demotivator. I don't know how many of you have read his Isaacson's biography of him. John's had a lot of negative characteristics too, the people around him and all. We're not trying to idealize him, but it is true that the positive characteristics that Apple got, definitely he was an embodiment of most all of them. So my purpose in doing this was to fill the gap between the people who run a company, start the company and drive it, and the company itself. Both are living organisms, as is the society, but there's a close relationship between them. And that's what I wanted to follow now. Take a look at it this way. You've got Jobs on one side, you've got Apple on another. I think it's clear that, that they have something more than coincidental. He took, by the way, Bill Marriott did the same thing. He took his own strengths, his own characteristics, and he built an organization to embody those. In Marriott's case, he wanted perfection. He was a people person. He wanted systematic functioning. He wanted everything to be done with the least waste and the highest quality. So he introduced the systems and the standards and all that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Jobs' values were different. His qualities were different, but he created an organization that institutionalized those qualities. There may be many people with high energy who are creative, but they don't all have the capacity to create an organization that will embody. And when they go, the company disappears or loses its character and everything. So somehow or other, it's a very interesting process. How did he institutionalize himself? How did he take, if you are an entrepreneur in the position of a Jobs or a Thomas Bata or a Bill Marriott, how would you take the values you have and the qualities you have and create an organization that was the embodiment of it? I'm trying to show you that parallel. I'm repeating myself for emphasis. The organization of the person and the organization of the company and the organization of the society have something in mind. They are three parts of the whole organization, of one organization, which is a living organism. And the more we tune into the organization of the company and the organization of the society, we become leaders. We become leaders. It doesn't matter where we start in the company or what job we have. We become leaders in seeing how the organization can grow and how the society can grow and how we can grow and the people with us can grow as we go through it. I hope the link is clear. So this raises a point. What's the relationship between the individual and the society? What do you understand about how the society grows and the individual grows? To understand that is a key to really understanding theory and practice of organization. Every company is not made by a single individual, and no company is made entirely by any individual. And no individual leader is responsible for all the accomplishments of a company. That's a myth to say that, and that's not what we're saying. Just for shortage of time, we abbreviated the presentation, but many of you may know the story already. The technology that Steve Jobs got for the Macintosh, he didn't develop it. He found it at Xerox PARC Research Institute, which was a research institute for the Xerox Corporation located 2,500 miles away from Xerox headquarters in New York, where they were producing copy machines. The Xerox Park in Silicon Valley developed this innovative graphic user interface with the mouse and everything. And they tried to convince corporate headquarters that they had something important and that the company should take note of it and do something with it. And the company didn't know what to do with it and ignored it. Steve Jobs heard about it, went into there, saw the technology, was virtually available free to him. He didn't create it. He had the vision and the courage and the sensibility. He didn't say, well, if this had any value, Xerox would have used it. He didn't rationalize and say, if this was really worth anything, that would have already happened. He said, this is great. You've done this. You've done something wonderful. I'll take it. And he took it. And so he's not the sole responsible party. That's why I emphasized he grew up in Silicon Valley. He's a product of his times. He's a product of the place in which he grew up. He's a product of the age in which the microprocessor was coming to bear. He's a product of the hippie generation of nonconformity, which valued nonconformity and individuality. So in a sense, Steve Jobs is a product of the society. But he's obviously not the ordinary product. We didn't all create Apple computer companies. We didn't all change the world. But what he took from the society. Think about it. What the company took, it took from the society. Apple didn't invent the microprocessor. They didn't invent the internet. They didn't invent the touch screen device. They didn't invent the mobile phone. They didn't invent the graphic user interface. So where did they get it? They got it from the society. They got the ideas, they got the technology, they got the organizational possibilities. The individual, the company, and the society are part of one whole. And what Steve Jobs did was, what the leader did was to see and understand the society and see its needs and see the resources it had and figure out a way to take them into an organization, to tap them, to create something phenomenal, phenomenally successful by any standards we know. But that's only half the thing. The individual is a product of the society. The individual creates not by himself. On a desert island, Steve Jobs would have been like all of us, starving or struggling for his own food. He took the resources of the society and combined them creatively, and he gave them back to the society and changed the society. He was a product of the society. He was also an agent for the change of the society. And that's why that line at the bottom of the screen, one person can change the world. He's not unique in changing the world. There's a countless list of people who have changed the world. Margaret Mead, the famous American anthropologist, once said, a small group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only way it ever happens. It starts with a small group that think and act differently, and the whole world is changed. So what does that tell us? It tells us the individual is not one among many. I don't mean the single person. I mean somebody who is called an individual. And I'm emphasizing that because I want to talk about it. What is an individual? What do we mean by an individual? In English, the word is ambiguous. An individual means one, single. But an individual also means something else. By the word individual, we mean somebody who's not like everybody else, not just a copy, a cookie cutter copy of everybody else, somebody who has something unique about them. We all have something unique about us. We may not all be anti-establishment, non-conformity people like Steve Jobs, but each one of us has a potential for uniqueness. And when we get to that potential, we reach our creative core. We reach the core in which, whether we're making money or we're making art or music or we're writing novels or we're simply making people happy and creating a happy family, whatever it is, we are at our best. We release our most energy and our most potential when we find that core of uniqueness that's not just trying to be like everybody else and is not just acting and thinking and feeling like everybody else. And that was the message that Steve Jobs gave at the Stanford commencement address. And I'm sure you know it already, but you've heard it from others. It's not an original message. It's been around forever. I'm trying to tie him as a person with the individuality in each of us. Each of us can be a creative person who changes, if not the world, changes our world. If not the company, changes the department and the area where we work. Not just for the sake of money and not just for the sake of the company's performance, for the sake of our own growth and development. Our deepest motives and aspirations for fulfillment in life are linked with the work we do and the world in which we live. He's an example of a person who was a fanatic in some ways. He was one-pointed in his determination in everything. But regardless of whether our goal is to make a happy family or a prosperous company or a better community, the power comes from us when we reach our, what I'm calling, individuality. So I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean by individuality. We don't have a lot of time, but if you have any question to anything I say, just interrupt me and don't wait for me to stop talking. I would rather have questions than be talking. So I raised the question, what is personality? Any of you studied psychology? Nobody? You're lucky. I studied psychology and I never learned about personality from studying psychology. I'm saying you're lucky. You can learn more just because, anyway, I won't go into that. We won't have time for it. What is personality? If you look up in the dictionary, you won't get a very good definition, but this is a kind of a general, unscientific concept of personality. When we say, tell me about his personality. Personality has mental attributes. People have different mental abilities and mental interests and so forth. It has social, emotional, vital energies. We have different levels of energy. We have different motives. We have different desires. We behave differently. We have energy, values, knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, habits, skills, all mixed up together in some kind of an organized unorganization or a chaotic organization. So let's look at that. I said we have got knowledge. Here are 5 leaders who did have an extraordinary knowledge. Jobs had a knowledge of his times and the needs and aspirations of his time. Fred Smith, he understood the importance of on-time delivery. And if you remember, I showed you in the first or second lecture how he designed the hub-spoke system and overcame the distances and the cost. And instead of buying 10,000 airplanes, which he could never have done, 100 airplanes was enough to service 100 cities because he understood organization. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who founded Google, Srijit mentioned it briefly in the last lecture. When they developed this Google search engine, they just had a knowledge of how to make it a little better than anybody else's, than the other 35 that were already on the market, so that it gave better results to people than the ones they had. And Warren Buffett, of course, speaks for itself. he's a household name around the world. The knowledge he's had about the value of companies and anticipating, not by speculating, but just knowing them better than anybody else. And Robert Wood was the one who moved Sears from mail order catalog to invent the first suburban shopping malls because he understood the demographic changes. So knowledge is a part of leadership and effectiveness of an organization. And then there are skills. We already talked about skills last time, and we're going to talk about them more in the next two sessions as well. But it's clear when we talk about skills, we're talking about lots of different types of skills. And I'm going to ask you at the end of the day, when you go home, to think about your own skills. Think about your own knowledge, think about your own skills, and how far in these 7 categories, where you're strong, where you could be better, where you could grow yourself as a person by strengthening your capacities in any of these areas. And here I've listed some important, I think are important skills for high accomplishment. Just take a look. Capacity to communicate, capacity to motivate other people, capacity to understand other people, capacity to observe, understand, make decisions, judge people. And we're going to come back next week and with some very good examples of how these skills, one of these skills, can make a person extraordinary. A combination of these skills in any field, even if he's just a private detective, can make him world famous. So this is personality. It's not a small thing. It's not a simple thing. It's a complex organization of knowledge, skills, and what else? What have I left out?
Attitudes and values.
Values. If society has values and organizations have values, and if they're important for an organization, they're as or more important for an individual. And we're going to have some great examples of that. Srijit, tell us about that.
Yeah, I don't have much to tell here, but we can see that there are some common personal values for all successful people. Let us think about some of the successful people, whether it is Lionel Messi, he's a footballer, or Tom Hanks, or Steve Jobs, or Sandra Bullock for that matter, you know. They have some commonalities actually, you know, as far as values are concerned. They are all punctual for sure. Very well knows the value of time and effectively does time management. This is common for most of the successful people actually. Most of the successful business personalities are good communicators, as rightly pointed by Gary sir. They are people with patience, perseverance, and believes in taking responsibility in any given situation. They have the capability of self-giving. They are generous and honest, you know, they believe in truthfulness, and most of them are people with integrity, actually. I can present 2 books, you know. Here, one is Good to Great by Jim Collins, if you are interested in reading more about this. And the other one is Give and Take, you know, 2 marvelous books available in Amazon for buying, you know, is there in Kindle as well. Give and Take is by Adam Grant. People with higher values succeed in their life is a life phenomenon. Please go through these books for further understanding.
Actually, Give and Take, the real, is only talking about one value. The people who are the greatest success are people who practice self-giving. They help other people become successful. It's done a lot of research on it. They're networking people whose networks grow because people want to relate to them because through their networks, they help so many other people that they grow wider and wider. Good to Great was the most famous management book of the 2000s. Came out around 2004, I think, 2005, at that time. And since you mentioned humility, they did a research on the leaders of the most successful corporations in America at that time. And the stereotype of a successful leader is kind of like a Donald Trump that tells everybody what to do and orders them around like a cowboy. And they found the truth was the most successful companies and the most successful leaders were just the opposite of that. They were not the people who were ordering people around and telling them, I know what to be done and just follow me and don't disobey. They were the people who constantly encouraged other people, who listened to them. And when they succeeded, they had the humility to give the credit to the people who did it, rather than claim to be the all-star. And by the way, this was a quality that Steve Jobs never had. He was just the opposite. He stole the credit for every idea that anybody had, and everybody knew it. That was one of his real weaknesses. The best example I know of this is Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, from South India, where I'm based. He's known throughout the company from beginning to end. He may not be the highest energy person. He may not have been the most technologically creative, not a finance man, but what he is known more than anything else, he brings out the best in the people he works with. He makes them more successful, and he gives them the credit for it, which motivates them. And so they're working for their own growth. And he was so successful at that he was chosen to be the successor to Larry Page and Sergey Brin to run this huge company because of this quality of humility. I'm going to skip that. I want to say a few things about personality. And this is not meant to be a crash course in personality, but because the word doesn't really explain what personality is, I find it helpful to think about ourselves as kind of like an onion skin, meaning we have many layers. And we live at different layers and we act from different layers. And the people who become more individual go to the deeper layers of what we call personality. So I'm kind of referring to personality, individuality as what's at the center of that onion skin, and hopefully it smells and tastes better than a raw onion. So what's on the surface? The surface is our manners. We learn from others, we learn from our society how to behave properly. What's the proper conduct? We acquire the discipline of doing things the way other people do. And without good manners, it's very hard to go anywhere in life. People don't like to associate with us. We qualify ourselves by our manners. But that's the most superficial set of skills and attitudes. It's not really the core of what makes us an individual human being. Then we've got our conscious beliefs, the things that we believe in and we act on. If we believe in hard work, or if we believe that we should tell the truth, or if we believe we should be responsible, and people are valued, we value people for he's got good beliefs, he means well, he's well intended. Deeper than that, we've got character. And what psychologists means by character is these are really our values. These are not the things we talk about all the time, but when we're in a tight situation, this is what expresses itself. We're willing to take a risk. We have the courage to stand up for our convictions. we'll stay with our friends or we'll desert them, whatever it may be. And most of this is subconscious. Beyond that, beyond the surface manners, beyond the behavior, beyond the character, we've got something we're called personality. It's the capacity to adapt creatively adapt to a new situation. All of the people we've talked about have personality to take their capacities and apply them in a new situation that's never been done before. Srijit, in the very first lecture, he was talking about Green Revolution. He didn't tell you the whole story because we didn't want to bother you with too much detail and everything. But the single man who was the leader and responsible for Green Revolution came from a farming community in South India, had been promoted as a minister in the central government because he was a freedom fighter before 1947. And in the next 10 years, he became the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Industry, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Planning, the Minister, just about every job he took, he did better than anybody else. He could take a capacity in one area and apply it in other areas. He was not a political genius. He was administratively creative because he could adapt to any situation, whether it's defending the country or trying to feed the country. And he became a national hero, and he was the one who doubled the food production. And he did his work he did in 1.5 years. And then he went on to other things and let them follow up on it. And finally, at the core, there's this thing that we're calling individuality, that we all have. It may be a creativity in music, it may be in human relations, it may be in any field, arts, anything, language or anything else. There's something in each of us that is unique. And if we have the capacity to find that and bring it out, our work, our life becomes an opportunity for growth. And if we have the capacity to find it in other people and nurture it, those people love to be around us and they flower and they grow. And any organization that can recognize and bring out the personality and the individuality of the people and give it an opportunity for growth, that's an organization which has the formula for nonstop progress, nonstop growth. It grows by growing its people. So again, what is individuality? What do we mean by it? What do you mean? Who are you as an individual? What do we really mean by that? So here are the characteristics that I think come from the center of what we mean by individuality. If we want to find the individuality in ourselves, we should find out where really our energy comes from, what really deeply motivates us the most. Which is the area where we depend not on other people, not on their opinions or their help or their support, but in the area where we really rely on ourselves, our judgment, our effort, our skill, our courage, our energy for accomplishment. That's the center where we're an individual, where we don't conform. I don't mean that we do the opposite of everybody else. I mean, we don't just develop our behavior in order to match what other people do. We do what we think is right. We think what we think is right. We feel what we think is right. We think independently. We have the courage, the strength, and values to be ourselves. This is the creative core of the individual. This is the creative core of a company. This is the creative core of any society. And most societies, they don't have many people who are acting as individuals. Most of us follow along. In a company, there are not that many people who lead the way. But you can have individuals at any level of the society and any level of the company. It's not just the farmer who innovates is an individual. The craftsman who goes, the musician who innovates. What Steve Jobs did is famous because he did it at the mega level, but we can be an individual in the way we teach, in the individual in the way we cook, or the way we raise our kids, or the way we lead in the community. Here's a list of people we've been talking about. I think you know all of these names. Anyone's name you don't recognize here?
General Maximus, we know it.
You know him. Anybody on the list you don't recognize?
Yes, Sally.
Martha, Marriott, Sally. Let's see.
Rosenwald was
Sears, right?
Robert Woodruff was, no, actually.
Not sure about the C.E. Woolman.
C.E. Woolman, I haven't told you about C.E. Woolman.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned it. C.E. Woolman was from southern state. I think it was Missouri or Mississippi. 1937, he was running a crop dusting operation. You know, small planes, propeller planes, that were spreading fertilizers and pesticides from the air in agricultural area. And this was the time when the first commercial flights were starting out of Washington. That's when Bill Marriott started serving his airline online catering business. C.E. Woolman was from a farming community. And he decided to start a small commuter airline. He didn't have any money. He brought together some friends and they passed a hat around so they could collect enough money for fuel so they could run a few flights. And the company grew that way. And it grew into one of the largest airlines in America, Delta Airlines, which year after year had set records for its profitability, but even more than that, for its employee satisfaction and loyalty to the company. Even when it had 70,000 people, the idea of the company was, we're a family company. It's a big family if you've got 70,000 people. Because the characteristic of C.E. Woolman is, he was a people person. Whoever he dealt with with them as a human being. And when we went into the company in '84, that's what we saw. This is a company that really values the human relations and the human being. And we heard fabulous, wonderful stories of Woolman, and I'm just going to tell you one as to illustrate. One night, you know, the planes fly in the night, and then they have to be serviced so they can go out and fly early morning. Their headquarters were in Atlanta. And there are people who have to be there in the warehouses to check out parts for the service people when they need to replace something on the planes. So there are people. There was a young man in the inventory department. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, all the technicians had come in. They had asked for the parts they need, and there was nothing to do. And it was late in the middle of the night. It's hard to keep yourself awake. He fell asleep. He fell asleep at the table. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, he had an uncomfortable feeling. And he looked up and he said, and he saw C.E. Woolman standing over him, looking down at him with a serious smile on his face, serious look on his face. And the boy said, uh-oh, now I'm going to get it. He'll fire me. C.E. Woolman was a strict disciplinarian, and he never liked any waste of money because he had grown up during the Great Depression when Delta was famous because they didn't waste anything. Woolman looked at him silently for a minute and made the young man very uncomfortable. And then he said, young man, if you're going to sleep on the job, the very least you can do is turn out the lights and stop wasting electricity. True story. The next morning, when this guy came back to work, he started telling people, you know what happened to me in the middle of the night? You'll never guess who walked in and woke me up. C.E. Woolman caught me sleeping. What happened? He told me I should have turned off the lights. And this story spread throughout the whole company, through thousands of employees. And what was C.E. Woolman doing? In one little sentence, he was communicating two of the core values of Delta. At Delta, we don't waste anything. And they really mean they don't waste anything. And we care about people. We care about people, and I understand you're tired, and I understand it's the middle of the night and you have no work. And this is the way a leader instills values, by the way he demonstrates and lives those values in his own life. And all the great leaders have stories like this. Woolman's got dozens of them, wonderful stories. Nobody asked me about Chris Steiner. You all know Chris Steiner, I guess, huh?
No, it was the next in the list, so.
Chris Steiner is one of my heroines, I should say. When I met Chris Steiner, she was 23 years old. And she was working as a brand manager at a company called General Mills. And she had just been she got her MBA and she got hired by General Mills a year earlier. And she was put in charge of a product called Cheerios. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Cheerios. Cheerios was the most successful breakfast cereal, maybe Kellogg's cornflakes.
Yeah, they eat it with the milk.
Exactly. For decades and decades, I mean for 50 years, Cheerios was a multi-billion-dollar product, this one brand. General Mills had many brands, many products, but Cheerios was their star product. And I interviewed Chris Steiner for our book. And she started telling me about her job as brand manager. She says, I've got a $500 million advertising budget. And I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this with it, and I'm going to do that with this. And I was bewildered. I said, wait a minute, Chris. I thought you said that you just got to the company a year ago, and you're in charge of the single most important, valuable brand in the company. Are you telling me that this company gives you full freedom and responsibility for the entire budget and marketing campaign of Cheerios? Absolutely, she said. I was bewildered. I pointed up. I said, what about them? I pointed out, what about them? The people above you, the whole company, up to the board of directors, who's responsible for the results of this, for the shareholders and everything. Oh, they give me the freedom. I was very skeptical. I thought Chris must be telling me a story, or they have told her to tell this so it would sound good in our book or something like that. So I went up and I met her boss and her boss's boss. And I said, you know, there's something about this young woman there. She's very impressive. She's got a lot of high energy and bright and everything. But, you know, she tells me that she's got complete freedom and responsibility for the budget for Cheerios for $500 million. I said, I find it hard to believe. And her manager, her boss's boss laughed. She said, that's exactly what we want her to feel. That's exactly what we want her to believe. But the truth is, she has freedom within well-defined limits, based on a well-defined history, based on a well-defined budget categories. And within that categories, within that history, within those policy framework, we try to give her the freedom to own what she's doing, to do the very best she can and not be copying down remarks and doing what she thinks we've told her to do. So what you're telling her is we have succeeded in giving her the feeling that she's making a creative contribution and not just following instructions. But the truth is that freedom is defined, well-defined within an area where she can exercise her judgment. And we've trained her, educated her, and protected her to have the best sound judgment she can have. So this, Chris, I list as great leadership, not just great leadership by an individual, but by a company that knows how to make people leaders. Knows how to make people leaders within the area of their competence, within the area of their responsibility, to release their energy and release their capacities for creativity. So every year, the brand manager for Cheerios and every other brand, their job is to reinvent the product, for rediscover marketing, to do it better and differently and more creatively than anyone's done it before, and not just repeat the same thing over and over again. So one of the greatest qualities of a good leader is to know how to give other people the freedom to lead, give them the scope and the freedom to lead. How about Bagger Vance? Anybody know this great leader?
No.
Well, you're going to get to know him before this course is over. You can do the research if you want, but we'll come to it. But he's the epitome of a great leader that I hope you'll remember when you get through the course. Okay, Bonnie, tell us about this. I want to say something about this. Bonnie's going to talk about the significant individual, and she's going to tell you what we mean by it, but I'd like to explain. It was the title of one of the chapters in the book, which we're going to ask you to read. But the idea was, my conviction is, any person who really wants to make a significant contribution and be a significant individual in a company, even if they're in charge of the custodial services or the housekeeping or the parking or anything else, can do so. And the companies grow the most that know how to make everybody into a Chris Steiner in their own area at their own level, to bring out the best in them. And that bringing out the best in another person, or better yet, bringing out the best in ourselves and the people we work with, that's what we mean by a significant individual. Bonnie.
Janani is doing this.
Okay, Janani.
Okay. We just heard about a number of significant individuals. Generally, when we say significant individuals, such people come to mind, famous people who have made a difference in business. They founded companies, contributed to its turnaround and growth. People like Woolman and Chris Steiner. Now, this slide is not about them. It is about you, about how you can become a significant individual. Becoming significant, it is a process, and anyone with the knowledge of that process and who is willing to take that effort can become significant. So it is about effort. As Edison famously said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Now, a study of many significant individuals in business, it shows us these following common characteristics that are listed here. One is, they feel the work is more important than they are. They put their work ahead of them, ahead of their convenience, their personal wishes all the time. They think about the work that is yet to be done. They don't dwell on the past accomplishments, on past glories. They are always looking ahead. And they are not really looking at the external recognition and the rewards that will come. Those definitely follow, but these individuals, they don't have that result as their topmost thought. What they are focused on is what they need to do. And they constantly strive to acquire new skills, not what they have learned in school and college, but it's called lifelong learning. They're always trying to acquire them. And when they do that, they are constantly assigned new and higher responsibilities, which they accept. Rather than doing just what they are used to doing, what they are comfortable, they take up these new responsibilities, and then they recognize their strengths, they are aware of their weaknesses, and they make a constant psychological effort to improve, to become better people, to become easier to work with, at treating people, at organizing time management, and everything. these steps, they sound simple, but then they need our full-time, lifelong commitment. And they can ensure that each one of you can become a significant individual in any field, either to grow within your organization or to outgrow it and to move to a higher level, or even to start an organization of your own. Growth is always from within. It starts from within. Everyone has that capacity to improve. And the one essential thing is to really want it. So it is a choice that every one of us has to become a significant individual.
So, Janani, you're saying we've been talking about a company grows itself by growing the society it lives in. And individuals grow themselves by expressing more and more capacities in the work they're doing. They grow not only in success by the normal metrics that and recognition, and they grow in capacity and the fulfillment that comes from that capacity. Thank you. Okay, well, we're at the end of today. You made it, you survived. Let's talk about next week. I'd like you to read the chapter in chapter 11 in Vital Difference, which is about the significant individual. Janani gave you a summary. This is for your own, this is for you, for your own growth and development. As long as you're working, make the most of it and get the most out of it. I'd like you to, for your own purpose, this is not a quiz and we're not asking you to give us the thing. Evaluate your own skills, evaluate your own values, because what we asked you to do for the company is equally valid for each of us as an individual. Try to identify where you can grow, where you can improve, both objectively in terms of skills and subjectively in terms of values. These are as much, the skills are the systems of an organization, or rather the skills are the systems of the individual, just like they're the heart of the organization, they're the heart of our functioning. The values are our core. The values are a core of our personality. Then I'd like to ask you to either listen to, watch, or read a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle. He's the original author of the Sherlock Holmes, not the ones you see in the Hollywood movies these days. Those are all modern versions. But the famous writer, English writer who wrote invented Sherlock Holmes, he's written 60, 70 stories. This particular story called Silver Blaze will really be very valuable to us, and we're going to discuss it at length next week, and I'm going to ask you about it, and I want you to think about it. It's the story of a missing racehorse, and it's the story of how Sherlock Holmes solves the mystery. And what we want, we're not doing this because we're looking for racehorses or that we want you to become private detectives. We're doing it because it gives deep insight into the capacity, our mental skills and abilities, our skills in thinking, observing, and decision-making. And we thought the best way to talk about that is to see it in practice. And I'd say, even though Sherlock Holmes was a fictional character, he comes close to being, as close as anyone can come to being a genius of a character, but through methods we can understand. And those methods, in the far as we understand them, are methods we can apply to be more effective in our own knowledge and decision-making. And we're going to take it up next week. So that's it, right on time, even though we took a huge, long, excessively long break in the middle. Anything you want to ask, anything you want to say? Enough. Okay, great. See you next Saturday then. Have a good week.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Gary. Have a
Bye.
nice weekend. Talk to
Thank
you
you.
later.
Bye.